the Assyrian American National Federation. I would like to welcome you all to our fourth lecture for today. It's All Roads Lead to Nineveh, New Approaches to Studying Assyrians. On our panel today, it's a panel discussion, so we have Alda Benjamin. She's a doctoral candidate at the University of Maryland, and her research interest in Assyrians is ideological and cultural organization and movements in the 20th century Iraq. We have Fadi Dawud from the University of London, or SOA, School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. And his research interest and his PhD, his doctoral work, is in Assyrians during the British Mandate and the change in social structure and whatnot during that time. And then we have Dr. Nicholas Al-Jidu, who recently just completed his PhD at the University of Sydney in Syriac or Assyrian Studies with a research interest, or his research topic was Assyrians of Ormia, sociocultural history of Assyrians of Ormia. And then last but not least, we have Dr. Erio Maku, who's a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Stockholm. His background is in political science, I believe, and he's really examined migration, organization, and identity of Assyrians in diaspora throughout most of the 20th century. So I think we have a very eclectic and very well-regarded and well-respected panel of academics before us today. Just kind of on a personal note, I mean, before I met any of them, I mean, I really was kind of exposed to their work. So I mean, I've read Alda's work on Iraq and political movements in Iraq before I even knew who Alda was, and Fadi the same way, and Nicholas the same way, and Edio. I mean, I've just encountered all their works, and so to actually get to meet them in person was really a blessing. And I love each and every one of them, and I really appreciate them, taking the time out of their schedules to come all the way here, because I know some of them have traveled very far. And so, to get this started, what we're going to do essentially is everyone's going to get 15 minutes to kind of present what their findings in their research, and kind of tie it to a general term that is starting to gain some popularity through various publications now, which is the term Assyrian studies. So it's a study of Assyrians in a modern context, so we can maybe say the last 100, 150 years. It really hasn't been totally defined, and really, I mean, these are the scholars that are going to help to define it in the future. And so I think everyone really here is having a chance really to be a part of history, essentially. And so we're going to kind of explore their research topics and how they fit into that general term of Assyrian studies. And then we'll probably just go into some short discussion and then question and answer. So to begin with, Alda Benjamin.
شلام عليكم باسيما رابع حضرتكم لها أمان ومجد أبا باسيما جوزيف بتقام نجي بقصة قديا تنطد منتها منه ومن نوخن خبيرتهم لها فخلط همزة تجي بتقوي بإنجلس قد شوية برمي أتيان لها. So my dissertation is entitled currently Negotiating Assyrians in the Modern History of Iraq. I'm right now in the writing stages. I finished the research and I'm writing the dissertation. And sort of to let you know how I got into this topic is for my master's thesis, which was at the University of Toronto in Syriac studies, I was interested in the role of Assyrians, civil society organizations post-2003 in the Nineveh Plains. After writing that dissertation, I got interested in the role of Assyrian political, social organizations historically. So that's how I decided to do an earlier topic for my dissertation, PhD dissertation, and focus more in history, modern Middle Eastern history. So for this dissertation, I contextualize Assyrians in Iraqi history by analyzing the role in ideological, social, and political movements of the 20th century. So this is really between, at a time when the state is getting stronger after a coup in 1958 and then in 1968 again. The state becomes stronger, and especially under the Ba'ath regime, and I'm interested in the role of a stronger state with the Assyrians. So this is pretty much the glue that glues the whole dissertation. You'll see me talking about 4 different aspects and a few different, the role of Assyrians in different movements. This is what really ties everything together, a stronger state and the Assyrian community's role. So I'm interested in 4 aspects of this history. 1, intellectual production. What is the role of Assyrians in the Iraqi Communist Party? the Kurdish uprising, the literary Assyrian nationalist movement, gender analysis, governmental policies, and transnationalism. So I'm specifically looking at the role of Assyrians in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. This is a period of interest for me, so the second half of the 20th century. And I will talk about each one specifically when in a bit. The significance of this dissertation, I think, is important for a variety of reasons. First of all, we learn about Iraqi history. It's 20th century socio-ideological movements during that period. Minorities in the Middle East, what role do Assyrians have in constructing the history of the modern Middle East? It is a very understudied community. Transnationalism, and the Assyrians are a very transnational community, although the various states are created in Iraq which contribute to the division of the Assyrian community in the early 20th century. Assyrians still see themselves in a variety of different ways as one community. And of course, the role of gender. For my research, I've traveled to 3 different countries, mainly, to collect data. In the United States, I've looked at various archives and libraries that are listed here for you. In Iraq, I've been to small libraries, religious, cultural libraries, like the Assyrian Cultural Center in Duhok. And I've also looked at archives at the Iraqi Library and National Archive in Baghdad. Also, the Assyrian Democratic Movement has a nice collection of Ba'athist archives pertaining to the Assyrians specifically in Baghdad, in their location of Baghdad. And the United Kingdom as well. I've looked at the British Library Public Record Office because that's where Iraq was a mandate state, so you find a lot of information pertaining to the Assyrians there. I've analyzed a lot of magazines that, some of which Mara has helped put together during this period, and this is just a short list of them. So the chapters, I basically look at, I have basically 6 chapters, an introduction and conclusion, and I'll look at the role of the Assyrians in the Iraqi Communist Party, the Kurdish movement, the literary movement, the coming of the Ba'ath and the Assyrian cultural rights in 1973, the Assyrian nationalist movement, which is reestablished, I think, in post-1933, popular culture, and resistors versus collaborators during the Ba'ath regime. And I'll talk about them a little bit more. So the dissertation basically starts with a background of the rise of nationalism in the 19th century, the dislocation of the community following the genocide of 1915, and the creation of a transnational community. The impact and the ramification of the Samanna massacre. I'm not really interested in the history of the Samanna massacre, but more so the effects of the Samanna massacre, which has the memory of the Samanna massacre 40, 50 years down the road, and its ramification on Assyrians in Iraq and transnationally, on the identity issues, which really does have a very large ramifications beyond the obvious, which is the killing of thousands of innocent people. And as a fourth point, of course, also the inclusion of the community and its urbanization, because really what's interesting in the 20th century, the second half of the 20th century, is that Assyrians do become more urbanized for a variety of different reasons. You know, it's either because during the Enfad campaign later on in the 70s and 80s, more so, the villages are destroyed, or in the 61, when the Kurdish uprising begins, there's a battle between, a civil war between the government and the Assyrians, and their villages are destroyed, so they're going to urban centers. Or they're going to urban centers like Baghdad, like Kirkuk, because there's important firms like the oil industry in Kirkuk, that the IPC, Iraq Petroleum Company, or because they want to get better education, go back to better universities in places like Baghdad. So the community is becoming urbanized, and this is sort of what I look at this period. For the first body paragraph, the Assyrians and the Iraqi Communist Party, it's interesting. This is a statue of Chama Chamas, which I took this image in Al-Qush in December of 2011. This is a park dedicated to him. I'm focusing a bit on the image itself. Many of you might know him, and I think I have some of his relatives here amongst us. Dima Yusuf. Toma Tomas was a very important Iraqi communist leader and also a Syrian nationalist figure. He's very important. He was born in the early 20th century, 1924, and he passes away in 1996. His body is eventually returned to Al-Qush. He passed away in Syria, Qamishli, and this park is dedicated to him in his village, in his town of Al-Qush. He's a very heroic figure who is inspired and really is influenced to join the Communist Party. His memoirs telling us that the Semele massacre, him not being able to get into university or high school rather, because he's a small town boy, and the Communist Party promises them socioeconomic equality. It's a secular party. So for a variety of different reasons, it attracts a large number of Assyrians in the early 30s, 40s, really up until the 60s or so. So I talk about that in that chapter, and I look at, most specifically, I look at court records, which I've acquired from the Iraqi National Library and Archives. In 1963, Qasim, who is believed to be closely associated with the Communist Party in Iraq, he's the president of Iraq from 1958 to 63, is toppled. He's eventually killed, and this is when the Ba'athists come into rule. So what happens really in Baghdad, there's mayhem in 1963. There's thousands of Iraqis who are killed, and many Assyrians are also imprisoned. Some of them are really not even communist. Some of them might not be associated with a political party. So when I went to Baghdad, I found these court records, and it was interesting. For example, this is a case where this is a criminalization decision that's given for Barkhum, an Assyrian man from Kirkuk, who was eventually imprisoned for 5 years and dies in prison. We don't know how. He, of course, denies being a communist, but regardless, this is how he is placed in prison. It's interesting, if you look at the criminalization decision, it says he claimed to be a descendant of the Sumerians. This is in the criminalization decision of the court. So really, these kind of cases in this period gives you interesting facts about the role of Assyrians and how they're perceived by the court system, by the country, and issues of identity and citizenship come up. The chapter on Kurds and others, Assyrians in the communist opposition in the northern provinces, begins in 61 with the uprising, the first uprising of the Kurds during this period, and goes on really until the early 70s. And I look at different things and why Assyrians join the Kurdish uprising. How do they join? Do they join as individuals or do they join as a group? Are they interested in furthering their own community's rights, or are they interested in sort of something else? And this is what it's an interesting chapter. There is the establishment of the High Committee for Christian Affairs in 1972. That's of significance. That's when Assyrians come into sort of real union and form an opposition during this period. And one very interesting figure at this time is Margaret George, who was born 1941 to 1969. She is known as the second Shamiran for Assyrians, and also the Joan of Arc of Kurdistan. This is how she's referred to. She's really she was a very strong fighter. So I'm very interested in her role as well. The fourth chapter, Literary Movement, the Coming of the Ba'ath and the Assyrian Cultural Rights. Here, the Ba'ath comes into power, and at the beginning especially, it's quite weak, and it's trying to bring a lot of people close to it. This is one argument why, for instance, Akram Shapira, I believe, makes in his book, why Assyrians are given cultural rights. They're given rights, Decree 251 in 1972, 73, and what happens, although these rights are limited, they really are limited, but they do give them the rights to open organizations, to publish newspapers, to have a variety of different cultural, linguistic rights in Iraq. And this really, regardless of how you look at it, it does lead to a nice, it gives them space in the public sphere to publish, to form organizations, to what I think is really a Syrian literary movement that begins in the 1970s. And you have a lot of publications, a lot of activity during this period. Here's an example of Murdana Al-Turaya is a very important magazine published by the Assyrian Culture Club in the the club was established in the late 60s before the formation of this law, but Assyrians are given the opportunity to form magazines, and here's one form of it, the Assyrian Literate Al-Muntaqaf Al-Athuri or Murdana Al-Turaya. This is a very important nationalistic organization as well, the Assyrian Culture Club. In Chapter 5, the Iraqi Assyrian Nationalist Movement, re-established post-1933, in the late 1970s, which I think really, because of the literary movement, a lot of young men and women who are as youth raised in these Assyrian clubs eventually come to the point of realizing that there needs to be a new nationalist movement re-established in Iraq. And I think it is a little bit different than the nationalist movements that we had before the 1933. Of course, 1933 is the Assyrian Nineveh massacre. This is why it's an important period. So you have organizations, political organizations established, like the Assyrian Democratic Movement in 1979, and there's interesting transnational interactions, really, that we need to look at between Assyrians in Iraq, Iran, Assyrians in Iraq, and Syria, and really abroad. And this is just a picture of some of the Assyrian men who were killed by the Ba'ath regime for joining the Assyrian Democratic Movement. And here's just an example of Ba'athist documents that I was referring to earlier. So to the right, Assyrian Nationalist Movement, this is the Ba'ath regime has come into, found this pamphlet issued by the Assyrian Democratic Movement, and they have given it to their sources higher up. On the right, here's a document from the 1980s where they're setting a program of how to Ba'athify society. It's really interesting source. Popular culture, transnational interactions. I want to look at the Assyrians. I don't just want to look at literate, highly educated Assyrians. I want to take other Assyrians into consideration. And I also want to take into consideration the fact that Assyrians are not all readers and speakers, and writers of the Assyrian language. I think Assyrians are reading public. Most of them are reading public versus a listening public. Reading public basically can read and write, and listening public can speak in Assyrian, but is not very literate in terms of writing in Assyrian. For people like that, the power of music and songs is really, really interesting, and the power of music and what I call songs of defiance. For example, the first mention of the Simele massacre in Iraq, I haven't found a written record of the Simele massacre being referred to as a massacre, but I have found it in songs in this period. So people are more comfortable singing about it than perhaps writing about it. Of course, you have to take into consideration the fact that you might not get into as much trouble if there's no written source for you to be confiscated with. So basically, and I also argue that music, musicians, singers, and cassette tapes, for those of you who know what cassette tapes are before CDs, were fluid and highly mobile, seeping through borders of the nation state and allowing the formation of a transnational Syrian community, which was in constant dialogue. For example, if Iwan Aghassi in Iran, in Urmi, or in Iran, or later on in the US, was singing about Assyrian nationalism or a song inspiring Assyrian cultural traditions, his tape, his songs would, it was on the black market, you couldn't really buy it, but somebody would sneak it into Iraq and people would make copies of it, and eventually everyone would have that. And it was really, really, really important for the reinforcing of an identity and a dialogue that was going on between Assyrians across borders. Here's a 1973 song that I was mentioning about Simele. These are the words that I transcribed. I don't have time to go through it, but this is in 73, and Shimon Bishmuel wants to really tell us and tell everyone that it was a massacre. In fact, the word massacre is mentioned 14 times in the song. So, and here's a flyer for Albert Tamus, who is an Iraqi Assyrian singer who goes to Syria. This is a flyer from Al-Hasaka, and he has this concert, and it's interesting, he's singing, he's, going back and forth between the borders, and Assyrians are really sort of talking to each other, reinforcing their identities or whatever issue that they feel is important through the power of music and songs. And finally, the final chapter is resistors versus collaborators. I want to be careful with using these terms, but they're interesting. So on one extreme, we have Assyrians who are oppositional fighters. They're fighting the Ba'ath regime in the mountains, and then on the other extreme is Tariq Aziz, who is part of the Ba'ath regime and really, really high up. And he changes his identity and becomes Tariq Aziz. So this is one very high extreme, but really more generally, how do Assyrians in general deal with the Ba'ath regime? What if you're a teacher and you're forced to be a Ba'athist member, or if you're a student in high school and you have to become a Ba'athist member? How do we deal with these people? And how do Assyrians really function under the Ba'ath regime? So this is another chapter that I am interested in. I guess we'll talk about the gap of scholarship later on, right, Joseph? So this is my dissertation at this point. I hope it is interesting for you, and hopefully one day I'll complete it and you will be able to learn a little bit more about it. Thank you so much.
I'll listen to Alda. Adia, we'll have Fadi Dawud make his presentation.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for the invite. Thanks, Joe, for organizing this, and for everyone else for coming. And thank you, actually, for coming to listen to us. My work is actually a bit different from Alda's in the sense that I am a social and cultural historian. I am really interested in cultural production and cultural ideas that actually emerged in the period from 1920 to 33. If you know anything about Iraq in 20 to 33, it is the period of colonial interactions with the Assyrians, particularly the refugee population that was brought from Urmia and the Haikari Mountains in the period. So my dissertation is actually entitled Assyrian Colonial Relations, the Makings of a Warrior Race in Iraq. And it covers the period roughly 1920 to 33-34. And in the dissertation, I actually, I'll argue that in a bit. What I'll say is I argue that the Assyrian identity shifted and changed as a result of these colonial encounters. This is Iraq. I will talk about Baquba and the Baquba refugee camp. So if you don't know where that is, it's somewhere here. I'll talk a bit about Mosul and the Smell Massacre. So the dissertation is actually divided into 5 chapters. The first chapter that I actually is as a background chapter. I work on the sort of the period of 1850 to 1919, and I talk about missionary encounters and early colonial encounters with the Assyrians. And this actually, in this period, we have a rich collection of sources for the period, be it from actual Assyrians who lived in the Haikari Mountains or Urmia, from missionaries that arrived, from colonial officials. So this period is easy to cover, and there's actually a lot of room for people to actually do entire dissertations on this period, and very little has been done. The second chapter, which is actually where I begin my dissertation, or my analysis, I guess, is the Baquba refugee camps. So I look at the refugee camp as an urban space, and I look at how people lived in the camp. I look at how British colonial officials dealt with the Assyrians in the camp. So I deal with issues like leisure, labor, and how they sort of formed new Assyrian identities in the period. I look at the camp as a space where poetry and music was produced, and how this poetry and music influenced this sort of cultural shift and change. I must admit, when I began researching, I thought this period, or this camp, would have a very, or massive sort of sources, or rich sources led by Assyrians. But unfortunately, the vast majority of people that actually lived in the camp are dead, and the written sources for the period is very scant. So what I've actually had to do is actually had to deal with the British sources and League of Nations sources, interviews that were conducted by colonial officials for political purposes to look at this period. So I must admit this is a shortcoming in the dissertation, but it also is a problem for people researching this period. The third actual and analytical chapter, the second analytical chapter in the dissertation, assesses the social and political changes in Assyrian polity in Iraq after the Baquba refugee camp. So I look from 1922, 23 to 31, 32, and how Assyrian sort of society changed internally. So I look at leadership changes, and I argue that the religious leadership in the community is weakened. You have 3 new types of leaders emerge, or leadership types emerge. those who were urban, educated individuals who actually take an important leadership role in sort of managing or administering the community. The second type of leader that emerges is the one that is a warrior. And what I mean by a warrior is, I'll touch upon that in a bit because that's my next chapter. But I briefly argue that those individuals who fought with the Ottomans, against the Ottomans, with the British, and with colonial sort of regimes in the period were labeled as warriors. And these people actually take important leadership roles in the community. We mentioned Putras today, there's Menekambar Jidu, and there are a few other individuals that actually take very important roles in the community. The third type of leader is the religious leader, although that's actually a very interesting dynamic in the period, because you see very young Marshamoon in the early period, you see the divisions between the various religious sects in the community take sort of shape. And eventually, I would argue, solidified in 1933 as a result of the massacre in Samel. The sources for this, I've managed to collect poetry, music, literature produced by Assyrians in the period, in addition to colonial sources. Personal accounts have been tremendous. And actually, as an example, is the British betrayal of the Assyrians by Yusuf Malik is a great type of source of these new urban sort of elite, I would imagine, or that's what I describe it as, urban elite that emerged in the period, who actually are disseminating ideas not only to Assyrians but to a larger audience. And you see their personal communications with British and League of Nations official become really important. There's Hormuz Rassam, who's another prominent individual, although he is a warrior in a sense, but he actually takes the role of an urban notable and actually goes to the League of Nations and manages to bring the ideas of the Syrian community, or the ambitions, I guess, of the Syrian community to the minorities committees at the League of Nations. The third chapter, or the fourth chapter in the dissertation, deals with discourses perpetuated by the League of Nations and by the British government about the Assyrians, and also deals with the way the Assyrian discourses dealt with themselves. So in this chapter, the main focus is the warrior race. The idea of the warrior race is that, or in sort of a eugenic type idea, that there are some races and some groups that are predisposed and genetically sort of made to fight and to be warriors. And actually this is actually problematic, but it becomes a very important discourse in the British and in the League of Nations sort of debates about the Assyrians. The British actually call these people warriors, and as a result they need to be sort of used for protection purposes. So if you know anything about Iraqi history in the period, Iraq was actually the first place to be administered by the airplane. So the airplane is used to administer and manage Iraq and control the population. And you have what is called the levies force emerge as the colonial arm of this administration, or this arrangement of managing the society and managing the country at the time. So the Assyrians, because they are predisposed to the art of war, and not all Assyrians, those who come from the Haikari mountains, because they are predisposed to the art of war, they are recruited into the levies force and they are used as warriors. They are used as the arm of the colonial regime. And I argue that these discourses help to separate those who came from the Haikari mountains from the remainder of Iraqi society and the remainder of the Assyrian society. And actually what it helps to do, it helps reinforce the idea as a result of warrior and as a result of service, we are looking for a nation state. So you have people like Al-Butros and Malik Kambar of Jidu and a few others emerge as these warriors pre excellence, and they actually become sort of used for political purposes by the British and by the League of Nations. They are put on display in order to show that because these warriors have helped us, we should help them. Now, this is actually what I mean by warrior. I'm not going to read all of this. This is actually the camp administrator, the Bakula refugee camp administrator, who says that the martial spirit of the mountaineer boys was further exemplified by their love for drilling each other, entirely picked up from watching their elder brothers in the contingent being drilled. And drilling is actually the military sort of, when you hold a gun and, you do military drills. And it was a common sight to see a squad of 10 or 12 ragged unrichens being put through their manual exercises by one of them members. And then it goes on and says, this is because they are so warriors, and you see the clicking of their shoes, and you see they are clearly genetically sort of made for this art of war. They are clearly warriors. Now, this is another idea. I mean, I use a lot of pictures, and you can see the British officers in this picture standing with 3 levy soldiers. This is from 1924, I believe. And you see, this individual actually later did a doctorate on the levies force at Selaz in the 60s. And it is sort of, it reinforces this idea. He says, these people were so strong and so ragged, they didn't need shoes. They would fight without shoes because they are so strong and predisposed to art of war. Now, moving into this, I argue that these sort of social and political changes help to reinforce the idea that these Assyrians are not sort of part of this larger Iraqi state, or the project of the Iraqi state. And so the final chapter deals with the few months prior to the Simele massacre, and of course the Simele massacre itself, and that's sort of the outcome, the immediate outcome, the immediate social and political outcome of the massacre. Actually, I will show you this. So I've collected sources, like this is one of the villages that was bombed by the Iraqis, during the massacre. This is actually 2 days after the actual massacre ended. The British Air Force actually went up there and did a survey and interviewed some of the victims of the violence. So when I look at this sort of period, I move away or shy away from using the massacre as a moment of time that is separate. I try to contextualize the massacre into the larger history and the larger sort of period that the Assyrians experienced at the time. But I also would try to do is move away from this nationalist or the idea that this is the moment where nationalism sort of occurred. What I try to argue is that this is the moment of the creation of the Iraqi state. So I argue that the Simele massacre created Iraqi and Arab nationalist discourses in the period, and this was actually the period when you see the Arabization and the further sort of the idea of Arabness sort of emerge as the predominant idea in Iraq. Now, for this chapter, both primary and secondary sources are widely available, but a problem is constructing an argument, because you see so many perspectives. Constructing an argument and constructing a narrative for this chapter was very hectic. Also, what was really difficult is to try to contextualize it. The vast majority of these sort of narratives just focus on the massacre itself. They don't focus on the period before the massacre and after the massacre. So this was actually fun to play around with. I mean, it was a really fun chapter to write. And because it was towards the end of the dissertation, or the end of the writing period, I actually really looked back at the entire work and actually focused this at the end, which is a final argument that argues that although socially and politically there were tremendous changes at the time, these changes have created sort of new arguments and new debates that need to be explored in the period from 33 and 41. Now, looking ahead, I actually am proposing postdoctoral research that actually looks from the Simele massacre to the Anglo-Iraqi War, because the story doesn't really end in 33. It actually continues to the Anglo-Iraqi War, and if you know anything about Iraqi history, that's when the Assyrians were used to kill, or not kill, but sort of used to defend British sort of establishments in the country in the Second World War. This is another picture of the Simele massacre. I'll leave you with that actually at this point, and hopefully we can have an interesting discussion about the sources and the materials that we've used and how they all tie into this larger narrative that we're trying to, or the larger objective of our research. Thank you very much.
Now we're going to have Nicholas Adjilu, Dr. Nicholas Adjilu from the University of Sydney. with this presentation on the Assyrians of Urmia.
Okay, first of all, very happy to be here and very happy to have you all here supporting all of us and our research. Now, I don't have a PowerPoint presentation, I have a slideshow. If you're from Los Angeles, I will just say, close your eyes and ears, because this is an abridged version of what I'm actually going to be presenting in LA to the community there in a couple of weeks' time. My research deals with the Assyrians of the Urmia region of Iran. Now here is a map of Iran, and that highlighted part there is the West Azerbaijan province, and there you have the different counties, Urmia, and to the north of it Salamas, and to the south you have Oshnabiyeh, Naqadeh, and Mahabat. There is another map of the Assyrian villages around Urmia. I'm sure many of you might originally come from the Urmia region. Now there have been many studies about Urmia, and there have been many sources used to study the history of the Assyrians of Urmia. However, one of the main issues is that there is an important source that has never been consulted nor used, and that's because it is primarily located in situ in the field. And I'm going to get to that in a second. I'm just going to go through a little bit about Urmia for those people that don't know much about Urmia. Urmia is one of those places in the world, in the Middle East, in the Assyrian homeland we should say, which obviously, because of its name, shows that it is an Assyrian territory, you could say, or it is a native Assyrian. It's part of the native Assyrian sphere. Urmia comes from the word Urumi, meaning the place of water in ancient Akkadian. Okay, so I'm just showing a few photos of Urmia, a few black and white photographs of Urmia from my own collection, which give you an idea of the world in which the Assyrians of Urmia lived in about 100 years ago, prior to the genocide. Some of these photos are archival and have never been published before. Now, Assyrians mostly lived actually outside of the town. They lived in a little bit under 200 villages in the countryside around Urmia in the districts of Salamas, Anzal, Narat Nazlu, Narat Ndita, Narat Baranduz, Margyawar, Targyawar, Solduz, etc. Most of them lived in a rural existence, and prior to the 1830s they weren't very literate. They had no schools, maybe only 5% of the population could read or write. Now, one of the main reasons why I decided to study the Assyrians of Urmia is because, well, by 1908, the Assyrians were the most literate, literate ethnic group in the Persian Empire. They were the people who could read and write. They were the people who were exporting doctors and engineers to the rest of Iran. The important thing we need to know about Urmia is that from the 1830s onwards, a system of mission schools started to develop. First set up by the American Presbyterians, then the French Catholics, and then the Russian Orthodox, which crisscrossed the area, basically. These were later joined by other missions, specifically the Anglicans. Now, here is a photo of some of the evangelical missionaries at Urmia in the late 19th century, or the late 1800s. So, these were the Presbyterians, and then you had the Catholics. So, you could see that by the 1840s, which was when the Assyrians had started to establish the first printing press in Urmia, as well as the first newspaper in all of Iran called Zahrir al-Bahra, or Rays of Light, that this community was fast becoming literate. I didn't mention to you the amount of Assyrians that were able to read and write by 1908. There were actually 80% of men and women,
Wow.
which is actually quite significant. Now I'm just going through some black and white photos. I think I'll go through them quickly because I have too many. Here is a very, very old photo which is in my private collection of a French Catholic school in Urmia. You can probably make out the nuns on either side. It's a very bad shot, it probably needs to be conserved. But here is another shot of some nuns, French nuns in Urmia, with some Assyrian women that were part of a sewing circle. And these were the Assyrians that converted to the Russian Orthodox Church. After World War I, most of them eventually returned to the Church of the East. Now, some photos of schools. These are schools from after the First World War. I think this is a school in Karajalu, the village of Karajalu. And this one, I don't know.
This is Karajalu.
This is Karajalu as well.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Put in
there you
there.
go. There you go.
Yeah.
My Farsi is not that good.
It's like Arabic.
So,
It's Arabic too.
oh, that's true.
Yeah. That's what I read.
Now, just to give you an idea of the terrain, Urmia is mostly plains. You have Dashtat Urmi, the plain of Urmi, the plain of Salamas, and a few other sort of flat areas. But around that you have a lot of mountains. And these will just give you an idea of what the area looks like today and some of the villages. For example, this is the village of Naze, and in the foreground you see the graveyard. Oh, sorry, Korse. No, Naze. And in the foreground you see the graveyard. This is the village of Mushawa. You can see that the Assyrians over there actually have freedom to use the Assyrian language on the street signs, which is a good thing. We must also not forget how old the Assyrian community is in Iran. Well, the records that we have go back to the first millennium AD. However, there are many Assyrian villages established around archaeological mounds or tells, and this is actually one tell in the village of Dizataka, and on top of that tell is the Assyrian graveyard. So that's quite significant. It shows that the Assyrians have been there for quite a long time. This is an example of the stratification of that mound. Now, these are just some photographs of some of the old homes. Assyrians in Urmia became quite wealthy. Now, I should talk about my thesis, huh? My thesis title is A Socio-Cultural History and Heritage of the Ethnic Assyrians of Urmia. Now, I'm going to get to my sources at the end, but what I found in my study is that through education, Assyrians in the Urmia region became very empowered. They became quite wealthy. That's an Assyrian house, by the way. You can look at the architecture, you can see the intricacy in the architecture. These are all examples of Assyrian villages. This one is Ada, for example. This is Satluwe. And you can see the quality of building of some of these houses. It shows that the Assyrians had reached a point where they had become quite wealthy. Unfortunately today, there are not many Assyrians left in the villages. They're mostly older people, and in many cases you will see one or two families, in some cases an old man or an old woman. This is Patawar, someone in the Patawar, okay. Unfortunately, this is a big problem for us, because a lot of our churches and a lot of our graveyards are being vandalized, and that's not, that's basically because nobody is there to protect them in a lot of cases. Or the people that have remained are too poor and don't have the resources to be able to build high walls around their cemeteries or to properly secure their churches. This is a big problem for us, not only in Iran but also in Turkey and Iraq. There is a big myth or legend amongst the Kurds that, well, Christians hide their gold in their churches and in their graveyards. And that always makes them a target for vandals, it always makes them a target for treasure hunters, unfortunately. So, more of these wealthy people's houses. When the Russians came, obviously they provided a lot of freedom and stability to the Assyrians in the Urmia region, and that actually led not only to an enlightenment, but also an Assyrian cultural renaissance combined with the education that had been proliferating there and the printed materials and media which had been distributed in the area since the 1830s and 40s. Now I'm just going to skip through all these. As nice as these photos are, and if any of you have any questions, you can always come to me at the end in question time if you want to know if any of these photos come from your village. Obviously, needless to say, Urmia was one of the places where Assyrian nationalism first flowered. Not the only place, but one of the first and one of the main ones. And it is still a hub of Assyrian nationalism and Assyrian national feeling and Assyrian intellectual output today. Hence all the Assyrian flags. Now, the Assyrians of Urmia belong to three main churches, or four churches. The Church of the East, the Chaldean Catholic Church, the Evangelical Presbyterian Church, and the Pentecostal Church. How am I going to
We have another 5 minutes.
Okay, that's sweet. So, just to show you some images from our churches in Urmia. Now, okay, I'm going to tell you the sources that I used. The sources that I used for my thesis were inscriptions. I haven't gotten to them yet. But there are two genres of inscriptions which come from the Urmia region, and they fall into the categories of dedicatory inscriptions from churches. And you can see one of them above the door of this church in Anha. And you also have funerary inscriptions, or gravestone or tombstone inscriptions. Now, these, I went out into the field over 2 fieldwork seasons, and I'm very grateful to the Assyrian Foundation of America. I'm very grateful to the Assyrian American National Federation and to other individuals and organizations that generously helped me in my studies and in actually conducting my fieldwork. So a lot of these inscriptions were taken from churches, a lot of these were taken from graveyards in Assyrian villages. What I'm showing you now are photos from what is purported to be the oldest Assyrian church in the world, the church of Matmoriam in the city of Urmia, which was supposed to have been built by the 3 wise men on their way coming back from Bethlehem. And this is his tomb in the church. Marsargis. These are just some of the old churches in Urmia, many of which have actually been graciously restored through the funding of the Iranian government and the Iranian Cultural Heritage and Tourism Organization, thanks to the efforts of our representative in the Iranian Majlis, Mr. Yonatan Betkulia. So, I've got maybe 3 or 4 minutes now, so I'm going to skip these nice pictures of old Assyrian churches and go and show you some of the inscriptions that I used. One more. Then I'm going to skip them quicker.
copy of your slideshow?
Sorry.
Do you have a copy of this?
Maybe not the whole slideshow. So, as you can see, inscriptions are usually located on buildings, so above doors of churches or within the interiors of churches, even houses. So, I was going to actually talk about the Catholics and the Protestants, but I mean, there's not much time. Okay. Now, one thing I wanted to mention as I'm concluding is that this is the only manuscript I found in the whole Urmia region, and it's actually not from Urmia. It is in the basement of the Urmia Museum, and it was taken from smugglers who were smuggling it either to Turkey or smuggling it in from Turkey to sell on the black market. It was written in Ashita in the 1870s. Our major problem with Urmi is that there are no manuscripts in Urmi. There were 2 gospel manuscripts, one in Eriava and one in Kose. Both of them are now lost. Or, well, one's being hidden, and the other one is lost. There are no manuscripts from Urmia. There are some which might be from Urmia, which have not been properly catalogued yet, which are kept by the Chaldean Catholic Archbishop in Tehran. But apart from that, in terms of manuscript evidence, there is nothing. And you'll find a lot of these are printed books. A lot of them are actually kept in churches these days. When people leave, they just put all their old materials in the churches. So, I collected about 2,800 inscriptions on which to base my thesis and to examine data from these inscriptions, whether they be names of people, certain dates, historical events that are recorded, professions, titles, other social things such as change of language. Obviously, the older inscriptions were written in Classical Syriac, and very interestingly in Salamis, they were written in Classical Syriac until the 1920s. But from 1839 onwards, which is exactly a year before the first book was printed in modern Assyrian, we have the first inscription in modern Assyrian from Charbash. So it's actually quite exciting to see the shift between Classical Syriac, from Classical Syriac to Neo-Aramaic, and what was used when. And a lot of this evidence, as I said, is being found in these cemeteries. These are some of the Assyrian cemeteries in the villages there. Some inscriptions are also inscribed on bricks. This is one inscription that is inscribed on the bricks of the church of Matsmariam in Gulpashan. And some are also carved into wood. This is one inscription from 1888. This is the earliest standing Protestant church in Urmia, and it's in the village of Ada. So, just some photos of inscriptions. They can be on cornerstones, they can be, as long as that, or they can be as short as one word, which is a date. There are many different, these inscriptions, for example, show different stages of renovation, from the 90s, from the 60s, and from the 1890s. And some of them can actually be quite elaborate. Obviously, I can't completely summarize a whole thesis in 15 minutes, but I've tried. And thank you very much for all of you for your patience. And if any of you would like to see my thesis afterwards, I have it as a PDF and I can show it to you on my computer. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you again, Dr. Nicholas Gido. And now our final panelist before we get to the question and answer segment is Dr. Ario Makbo at the University of Stockholm.
Thank you, Joseph. I'd like to start by thanking both Joseph and the ANF for inviting me and having me as part of what so far has been an excellent panel. My presentation will be different in that I will not be talking about my dissertation for the simple reason that my doctoral dissertation did not deal with Assyrians. But I'd rather try, with my background as a specialist in modern European diplomatic and political history, build a bridge between the empirical research that has been presented by Nick, Alda, and Fadi so far, and maybe a bit more general discussion about Assyrian studies, what we mean by that, what my experiences are coming from my field, and what other opportunities I see or have had, and then what other challenges there may be for us, for the Assyrian community as such. So first of all, what do we mean by academic discourse? Because I put the title for my presentation, Assyrians and Academic Discourse. Well, discourse basically means any kind of communication. So in our case, it's reading, writing, learning, teaching, discussing, and so on, with each other, with our students, with the community, and also stimulating this kind of communication among our own community, but also a broader public. And I'd like to go through my own experiences first, give a short background, and then go into different ways of getting published, initiating research, and trying to establish a certain interest in Assyrian topics in academia. So very shortly about my own background. I was born in Germany, brought up in Germany, did not really have a very good command of the Assyrian language, at least written. I went, shamefully, but I went 9 years to Assyrian school, and I do know how to read and write my own name and stuff like that. But it wasn't an interest to the extent that would justify an academic approach. And also in terms of history, I was generally interested in topics other than only Assyrian history or Assyrian culture, and so on. And as for languages, also I did not learn to speak Turkish, Arabic, Kurdish, or any other language of the region that you will very often need in order to be able to conduct research in certain fields that I would argue dominate the current discourse, at least in academia, but also dominate the picture that we have of our own history. So one of the main tasks for me was to find an academic field where I, with my background and command of languages and interest, could contribute or bring up certain issues that were relevant to the Assyrian community as well. So within academia, I'd say that the discourse is dominated by certain fields, like Assyriology when it comes to ancient history, like Syriac studies, which focuses very much on religious themes, on the literature, or also other fields like modern Middle Eastern studies, or Semitic studies, and other linguistic disciplines. And very often this heavily influences young students, and also is seen as an obstacle when trying to choose a certain major, or when thinking about pursuing a PhD and so on. Whereas I think that it doesn't have to be that way, and just to give an example of some of the fields where you can bring up Assyrian topics either as a case study, you can make it part of a comparative study, or you could bring it up in different ways. Or in the humanities, history in general, that may be contemporary history, modern history, and in general history departments, such as the one where I work, literature, diaspora studies, genocide studies, philosophy. In the social sciences, you have political science, sociology, anthropology, even law, I know of one fellow studying the role of the Assyrians in the Lausanne Treaty of 1923 from a law perspective, economics, and so on. There's probably a bunch of other fields as well. So I think that is something that we have to be aware about. You don't have to be a shamasha or an expert in languages and in the region where we come from to contribute to the study of Assyrians. And then another experience I'd like to share is the difference in similarities that there are between the different countries and the system that there are in different countries. And that is in regard to the way studies are organized. Undergraduate, graduate programs are very different. I myself, I started studying in Germany, but finished my degree in Sweden, and I've been a research fellow in the UK and in Switzerland. So there are differences when it comes to both studying, applying for fellowships, developing a certain publication strategy, for example, but also acquiring knowledge about certain teaching styles and so on. So opportunities for a guy like me, who, as I said, doesn't have a background or a knowledge of languages such as our other panelists. So as I said, I was mostly, or I am mostly interested in diplomatic history, the history of international relations, and I wrote my master's about the Mosul dispute between Great Britain, which was a mandate power for Iraq, and Turkey in the 1920s. And my focus was really on the diplomats and the diplomatic process and the way both parties tried to draw up the border and win this diplomatic struggle to secure their own interests. But as I did so, I of course did have the opportunity to bring up the role played by the Assyrians and how these parties looked at them, how the minorities, and among them the Assyrians, influenced this diplomatic process. So my sources were, for example, the archives of the League of Nations, archives in Stockholm in Sweden, because the Swedish delegate to the League of Nations was actually the chairman of the committee that was sent to the ground to write up a report for the council, and diplomatic archives in the United Kingdom as well. And what I did after my thesis was publishing it in a peer-reviewed journal. And the good thing about that is that it ends up in a database and will always be searchable. Most often it comes up through a very simple Google search, and it doesn't only come up when you look for Assyrians, but it will come up if you look for Mosul, if you look for Turkey-Iraq border, if you look for any kind of diplomatic stuff of the 1920s and so on. And I think it's a good way of writing Assyrians into broader subjects, and not only focus on the community, but try to integrate us into general discourses on the countries where we come from, on the countries where we live, on the decision makers that have influenced our own history and so on. So that is one way of contributing to knowledge about Assyrians without being actually a specialist. A different project is has resulted in the publication of an edited collection, which I did together with Servan Donovan, who's an assistant professor in Roger Williams University in Rhode Island, and Unra Chepres, who is an associate professor at Uppsala University in Sweden, which is Sweden's leading research university. And we try to both republish old influential papers and stimulate new research about the theme of continuity. Not only empirical continuity, but also continuity of different kinds. Also modern ideas or the modern construction of the idea of continuity and so on. And the book deals with both the ancient and medieval worlds, with language and identity, and contemporary politics and social issues, because very often actually history is both approached to and written from a contemporary point of view. So very often history is not only history, but it's more than that, is the way we today look or believe what history is. And it's called The Assyrian Heritage, Threads of Continuity and Influence. Another way, in addition to publishing, which most often is directed towards an academic audience, is of course lectures, public lectures for the young community, at conventions like this one, at specific lectures, but also maybe at youth events, of which we have quite some in Europe. Some of the posters for some of the lectures I did about modern Assyrian identity and history in Europe. It's also lecturing as to a non-Assyrian audience. For example, about immigration, about refugees, and so on. So there's a lot of stuff that where Assyrians need to be included into the general discourse, and I don't think we will succeed doing that if we do not try to present our research even outside of our community or outside of the academic circles that specialize in our history and language. And another small example I can give is that I do teach a course on genocide in the 20th century at my university, and there, of course, I deal with a lot of case studies, but do pay more attention and add maybe a specific focus on the case of the Assyrians, and maybe more so than a colleague of mine would do. So even without being a specialist, I think there are opportunities for us to raise our questions and initiate a certain interest. So I don't think lack of the command of certain languages or even personal interest in certain topics should be seen as obstacles. I think it's important to diversify our research and the literature. And it's also important to be aware and to raise awareness about among our young students about the perspectives and obstacles that there are in academia in terms of funding opportunities, permanent jobs, mobility as a very important feature if you want to pursue an academic career and so on. So how do we do that? And what are the challenges? And just very quickly, what I see so far. I mean, most importantly, I think is the establishment of funding bodies and us trying to strengthen the ones that already exist. Endowment funds, we do have some of them, like the Assyrian Heritage Fund that just attended a lecture at the University of California, Berkeley. Some of them try to organize lectures, annual lectures. Others try to allow graduate students to travel and do some archival research and so on. Scholarship programs, I do know of some. There are a few examples. There's the Vodafone Foundation in Germany, which gives scholarships to Assyrian students. We do have the Assyrian Foundation of America, which supported my research, for example, together with the Assyrian Foundation of the Netherlands. And this organization too supported my master's work and basically allowed me to publish the article that I showed just a few minutes ago. So I do think that we have to think in a long-term perspective and in terms of creating a sustainable structure. We need an infrastructure And we need to get away from short-term thinking, project-based thinking, from putting money and efforts and time into projects that at some point come to an end, and then there is, in best case, there is a publication, but you do not always see that flow of activities, that flow well, simply that flow of activities in academia, but very often it comes to an end when certain people disappear or do not have the time or energy anymore. So I think it's very important to create a certain infrastructure that allows us to have this flow and this continuity in academic activity. Publication outlets is something else that we need to think about if we want to see Assyrian studies as a field of its own. That is both integrating Assyrian topics in different academic fields. I put a question mark behind Cold War history, and I'd just like to give a very short example. And from the Journal of Cold War Studies, which is published by Harvard University and by the MIT Press, and which quite recently published an article called "The United States and the Kurds: A Cold War Story." So what I want to do by giving such an example is that it depends on how you frame a certain question or a certain topic, and make it interesting for people from different fields. And that is also the way you will become part of the discourse. And by having publications such as this one, the role of the Kurds in Iraq in basically during the 1950s and the 1980s becomes interesting to people interested in the Cold War, in American foreign policy, and so on. And I'm not sure whether we always are aware of these things when we speak about Assyrian history and what we need to do and what Assyrian history essentially is, how we should research it and teach it. Academic journals, book series. I know of one new book series in Assyrian Studies edited by, again, Sedgwick Donovan and Professor Hannibal Travis. So we see that there are certain elements indicating that we may witness the establishment of Assyrian Studies as a field. Academic infrastructure, and this is going to be the end because I know I'm running out of time. I've actually had already 2 minutes too much. Study programs. I just know of one concrete initiative, which basically is so far only in theory. And that again is supported by Professor Jeffrey Kahn at Cambridge University. So that is the professor that allowed us to establish MAR. And this is called MAR. Don't know, it doesn't really sound good, but it means Modern Assyrian Research Program. And it basically is the theoretical, or the foundation that will allow us to establish a program, an undergraduate program in Modern Assyrian Studies. So students could go to Cambridge and study for a major in Modern Assyrian Studies, or a bachelor's in Modern Assyrian Studies. But for that to be put in practice, we need funding. It's very much about funding. Chairs, eventually professorships. I think after 50 years in diaspora in Europe, more than 100 years in this country, the time has come to think in terms of finding chairs for research institutes and creating these kind of structures that will see us multiplying our numbers, the numbers of publications on Assyrians. So with that said, I'd be happy if we could maybe start a general discussion bringing together both the examples of research that all of us have given, and maybe talk about Assyrian studies or as a field. Is it necessary? Do we need it? Do we agree on what it means? How do we define it? And so on. So thank you all for listening.